Can we see it? All right. So this is going to be a panel about a 21st century village. Can I get an amen? None of you have any idea what that means. Shame on you. Okay, here we go. So the first question that we're going to ask is, what on earth is a 21st century village? And Erik, I'm going to direct this to you.
Yeah, so this came out of a pithy statement I used to say when I ran so we used to build public Wi-Fi networks across Africa and built the largest public Wi-Fi access across multiple countries and the continent. And we used to say, you can't have a 21st century economy without power and connectivity. Meaning that you cannot take part in the digital economy globally if you do not have access to these things. And first world economies have access to cheap, ubiquitous, always on power and connectivity so they can do that. And it's interesting because when I came up with this, I wasn't talking about it in the frame of Bitcoin, right? But what became clear to us, even before we sold that company, was that you needed payments integrated as well. Like these three parts are all necessary for people to be part of an economy. And it was through future conversations a couple years later with Ash, actually, that we started talking about what does it look like if you were to already be bringing in energy and connectivity into these locations, but you also brought payments in. What would that kind of more holistic infrastructure for the community look like? So I mean, and then Ash has kind of taken it from there. So I think actually you should jump in here.
Okay, I'll add just a little bit. So in November, we had the privilege of going to Bitcoin Beach and seeing the work there. And I think one thing that we learned from that is the significant role of a donor and a way to get liquidity into a circular economy to kickstart it. And then we were in near Nairobi in March, and we're learning about gridless mining, and we were doing this design lab where it's this learning process where you get Bitcoin technologists and missionaries and locals, so in this case Africans, that understand their context and all the challenges. And we're doing this design process where we're throwing around ideas, and we realized, wow, if you have a community that's just been electrified, they've just gotten Starlink and internet connectivity through this process. Now you have a power provider that is receiving Bitcoin, right, for the energy they're providing. Wow, you actually have, through the Bitcoin mining, a liquidity source and like a big Bitcoin buyer in that village. Could that be enough to kickstart a circular economy in a more sustainable way? And then we were also in this design process with, shout out to my man Skylar, who was working with Fedi at the time, and we had this whole like federated eCash tech stack. And we're like, what if the whole community could use that? And you could put all the apps that they need to pay their electricity, to do fiat to Bitcoin exchanges and other gig economy or other aspects on that whole eCash federation, which is a whole nother great topic we can talk about. And it just started the idea. And so it really is, I would say, still a theory, an idea being developed. But Erik said we need controversy to make panels interesting. So maybe, Mike, tell us why that won't work. Since you've been at this for a few years and are familiar with the challenges.
Let me do this, because I mean, you guys saw Mike. That's a fantastic. All right, Ahshuwah should host a podcast. Okay, he should host our podcast with me. Okay, so Mike, we saw Mike on the video earlier, but Mike, you're the only one who hasn't gotten to introduce themselves. So I'm going to let you introduce yourselves in whatever way you see fit.
Okay, my name is Mike Peterson, one of the founders of Bitcoin Beach, which is a circular Bitcoin economy in El Salvador that kind of kicked off the El Salvador adopting Bitcoin as legal tender.
Yeah. Yeah. And so again, having the privilege to come and see the work, that you guys, again, and Mike will be the first one to tell you, maybe his staff will be the first one to tell you, it's not just Mike. This would have been impossible if it was just Mike. There's a whole group of people, dozens of people who have been working tirelessly for years to help make this possible. So Mike, I'm going to ask you, so again, I know for a lot of people, they hear El Salvador, Bitcoin, and they're thinking, kind of like third world country, hyper technical, like this it's hyper technological. This seems like a match made by two 14-year-olds. Like, this doesn't seem obvious that this would be a natural thing or a helpful thing. So what would you say to people who think that sounds insane?
Well, I mean, honestly, actually using Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis with the tools that are out there now is not that technical. I mean, anybody who knows me knows that if I can use Bitcoin, then the lady living in a shack can use Bitcoin. I mean, I still use Earthlink for my email, so that tells you how technical I am. And whoever it is keeps hacking it, please stop, because, I think that we overestimate the technical aspect of it. And I think people in the US, I think a lot of people are still under the assumption that smartphones are a luxury, but they really aren't in most of the world. Even the very poor communities, at least somebody in the village, a good proportion of the village will have smartphones, because it just makes so many things in life so much easier. A lot of them have family that are overseas sending money back. It facilitates that. It facilitates that communication. A lot of them don't have vehicles. They're riding, they have to take the bus or walk places. So to be able to communicate and to make cut out needless trips is a huge advantage. And so they will spend a significant amount of their money on their smartphone and having that. And so I think that's one of those things we think is a hurdle that really isn't there. Now, that's not saying that we don't need to make wallets in ways that are easier to understand for people that are living in conditions where maybe the QR codes are hard to read because they're out in the harsh sunlight, or the environment that they live in means their phone is only working half the time. There's those type of hurdles, but I think in general we underestimate just how Bitcoin works better than fiat. I mean, it actually happens. You can immediately send a lightning payment in this village where that same person doesn't have access to a bank account, and before their only way of moving money was to physically move the money.
So can I layer on something here? So what's interesting about, I don't know anything about Latin America, I've never been. So, but it's the numbers sound similar to what we see in Africa, which is you'll find 20 to 40% banked population in any country at most, right? It's mostly less. You'll find maybe 60% of people will have a smartphone. You'll have good accessibility of connectivity, but only 20% of the people with phones can afford to be online, right? And so you get these kind of the strata problem of affordability versus accessibility, of power, of connectivity, of these things. And if you can layer in things like what Ahshuwah did in South Africa, KG, with building an SMS-based payment system with Lightning, right? All of a sudden things get really interesting. The truth is, technology does not get in the way of Bitcoin adoption, and the communities that have access to it will find ways to make it work for them. And I think that's what's so impressive about what you have done in El Salvador, is like the community has come up with their own ways to use it.
Well, I think, too, it actually helps drive the adoption of technology, because then it makes it even more valuable for them to spend their resources, and they can operate more efficiently in other ways, so they're earning more in their business. So it's kind of this virtuous circle.
Well, so the way we used to talk about it is like we would walk into a village that had one smartphone and in the whole village, and after a month they would have 30, right? And because it comes down to people's spending power, right? If you realize that you can actually afford to get online, then you'll spend the money to buy a smartphone, or at least a smarter phone, right? And people genuinely want to be a part of this kind of global economy, be able to access things and sell things beyond their physical borders, right? The physical area. And if they can afford it, they will then spend the capex. They'll spend their personal capex to buy that phone and do something with it.
Mike, what kind of impact did you guys see from a Bitcoin circular economy in El Salvador? Like just some practical ways in which you saw it affect you, the people there.
I mean, how many hours do I have? It's, it really opened people's eyes to the fact that they were not relegated to living in poverty in this little village, that they could participate in the global economy, that it was easy now for them to move funds back and forth. They could work for companies in the US or Europe and receive, the wages that are normal there without having to actually go there. And so there was just on the practical level of moving money, that was one aspect. The other aspect was helping them understand money for the first time. Most of them have never, like many Americans, never given a second thought to what money actually is. And so when they start dealing in Bitcoin and they start seeing the volatility, but over time seeing that it can buy them more and more, then they start doing research of what is money and why is this other money we've been using, which in El Salvador was the US dollar, why did that go down in value over time? Which incentivized them always to spend, because they're like, I better spend it now because it's going to be worth less in the future. And most of them didn't have access to any type of thing that would hold value. So a common thing in El Salvador would be to buy blocks, for construction blocks, because they knew that in the future those blocks were going to cost them more, and they needed that. They're constantly in the process of adding on to their homes as they accrue the resources. So they'll just buy a pile of blocks, knowing that that's kind of a store of value. That's not a real compelling store of value, and that's not something that's going to motivate you to truly be a saver. So when they are introduced to something like Bitcoin, where they actually see that they can not just store value, but that what they can purchase with this new money will go up over time, it really helps them to become savers for the first time.
Thus giving new meaning to the phrase TikTok next block. Maybe that was a helpful framework through which to, in the future understand Bitcoin.
We need to come up with like a Bitcoin TikTok dance.
Yeah.
Or something.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, any Gen Zs here?
I like this brainstorm we have going on. Like the dad jokes flowing, crazily. Okay, Mike. So, you guys, when did Bitcoin Beach launch? It was
2019. 2019.
Okay, so here we are, 5 years later. There's obviously a number of other projects, Motive, Bitcoin Akasi in Africa. So there's a bunch of smaller ones that are more fledgling. What are some of the factors to basically seeing successful circular economies? I mean, they're not everywhere yet, and there's tons of challenges. It's not like you just decide to do it and then you end up on 60 Minutes. It's not just how it works. So what are some factors and keys to having successful circular economies?
I think that the real important thing is to think small, and that's challenging for people because we always want to start out thinking big. But with Bitcoin, it's very important that you have that network effect, and so that you start with a small group of people that are willing to start exchanging Bitcoin and opt out of the fiat system. And that is really contagious. That will spread as other people see this small group of people's lives change. They'll start coming to you and say, well, hey, I want in. Rather than if you do the shotgun effect and try to onboard a bunch of stores and they think you're like the Amway salesman, trying to push some pyramid scheme on them, and they will resist it. But if they see it kind of grow from within, it makes it much easier. So that was from the beginning. We really tried hard in El Zonte. We're going to keep it specifically to this small village. And we resisted. A lot of people were pushing us, hey, you need to expand. And we said, no, first we need to make sure that it is functioning well here, that it is actually sustainable, and then we won't have to work so hard as we expand it throughout El Salvador and then the rest of the world. And we've seen that happen. And so as we are working with other projects, today we actually just, over at the Bitcoin Conference, we just made an announcement that we have 22 grants that we're giving away from 5 million sats to 1 million sats. So not huge amounts, but just starter amounts to see if these projects where we have people that seem like they're willing to put in the work, and then we're going to be able to go back to them and give them more funding. But these are projects that probably none of you here have heard of that are springing up all around the world. And so that's what we say is just start small, and it really is those small groups of people that spur revolutions.
That's really helpful. Okay, Ahshuwah, so we took a trip to El Salvador, and then we took a trip to Kenya. And one of the primary reasons was to do these design labs. So what is a design lab, and how have you seen it help missionaries begin to adopt Bitcoin, or just, again, impoverished people begin to understand Bitcoin?
So as I was trying to introduce Bitcoin to the missions world, I realized that we needed to take a bottom-up approach. We couldn't just keep kind of going after the boomer leadership to convince them, hey, you got to use magic internet money to do your work. And they're just like, Nope, they won't go there. So instead we said, let's find the innovative, forward-thinking leaders that are already hungry for this. Like people in this room where you just start talking about it and they're like, oh, I get it, let's do it. Like, what are we waiting for? So we said, let's find those people and let's get them on the ground to see active projects that are happening, like what these brothers are doing. And so you just lock in a room the technical experts and these mission workers, and you see what can be built. But the key is you're not building like, and this can happen with Bitcoin. I see it where this is my hammer, right? And everything is a nail, right? This is my Bitcoin, and I'm gonna shove it down your throat, and it's gonna fix all your problems because Bitcoin fixes this, right? I can list a whole lot of problems that Bitcoin does not fix. And if you go in, especially cross-culturally, into another context, and you're like, Bitcoin, 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 and they're like, we need toilets. Does Bitcoin help me with toilets? Right? So you start with an empathy process, a learning process. You make sure there's representatives and voices from the actual community. They're saying, this is what I deal with. And so we did a bunch of interviews, a bunch of this whole empathy process from actual locals on the ground. And then from there, and the Bitcoin kind of experts and technologists listen, and they're like, maybe this, and it's kind of like this democratic learning process where you're throwing around different ideas, and then the whole group kind of votes on, oh, let's try to build this. And then you try to build a prototype, which is just an idea. It probably won't work. It probably has things that are good about it, things that are bad, and you say, we will test this and see what comes of it.
I think one of the big takeaways, because being in El Salvador was my first experience with a design lab, and being perfectly transparent, when you're beginning this process, it almost seems pedantic, because you're like, well, I've thought about Bitcoin for years. I understand how it works. I see this problem. It's easy for me just to diagnose what your problems are and just, again, jump in there and just basically say, hey, if you just do this, and this could get better. But what this process is actually incredible, because you basically, the person who you're there hearing from, they go on this journey of discovery to realize, oh wait, I've never had to articulate maybe some of these problems, and by articulating them and by understanding some of the Bitcoin pieces, they're convincing themselves. They're becoming convinced on their own, which is just always it's going to end up with more longer lasting conviction and fruit than if they're, and then also the requirement of, just the dependence on you in the future. If you're just always the expert, then there's just going to be a heavy reliance on you going forward versus them just realizing, wait, I can understand this. I understand this. Okay, yeah, this connects to this. And so I just really grew in my appreciation for the process as I went through it.
Quick question for you, Jordan.
Yeah, do it.
I actually don't know the answer to this, and I was at one of your design labs.
Yep. Ahshuwah's Design Labs.
Ahshuwah's Design Labs, which is, how do you find the church leaders, local church leaders, and local missionaries? Do they already know about Bitcoin before they come to that? Do they just sign up and say, I want to learn something? How do you actually source?
So it was a mix. So my partner in crime, Nate Schultz, is like the most connected missions guy that I've ever met. Like, his black book is just overflowing. And so I think we got back from El Salvador, did the holidays, and we had like a month, and he sent out like 60 emails and just said, hey, this might sound crazy, but here's what we're doing. And then from that, you get a few responses. And then you guys both helped a lot too, because then you have connections on the ground where you're at with other entrepreneurs or technologists or Bitcoiners. And so it really was a combination of partnering with a host somewhere in the world who had connections, and then us just throwing the net wide in the missions world. And you invite a few hundred people and 25 show up.
Yeah. So again, what Ahshuwah is saying is, please blow up his inbox if you're interested. Okay. So we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask this to each of you. So as you guys look at this, and you guys look at the prospect of using Bitcoin, what are some of the, I would say, maybe the pitfalls? What are some of the things that, maybe lessons that you've learned? You thought this would work, you thought this would be a good idea, and then you just realized with time and with experience, man, this seems so intuitive that this would work, but it just didn't. What would be an example of something like that, maybe for each of you?
Okay, so one of the things I've learned about building a number of businesses in Africa is that you say start small, I say start slow. Like everybody wants to run into things and see this quick scale of things, and that's a really quick way to run into a wall, right? So what you need to do instead is like slowly go at these things. And you know, I think in the Western construct of building things, it's really frustrating for people. But in Africa, and maybe it's in Latin America too, but in Africa, like things have more friction, and so things take time. And if you are patient with it, and you can get to this next step and say, okay, I've learned that, now we can do the next thing. You can actually build a foundation that can grow. But if you don't build that foundation first, then it won't grow. You will not have the people around you. Africa is very relational, so people matter. And if you don't bring people with you, then it won't go anywhere.
I would say one of the biggest challenges is just the security aspect of Bitcoin and the custodial versus non-custodial wallets, and how to walk with people in a way where you don't overwhelm them as you're onboarding them, but also that you help them ratchet up their security protocols as the amount of Bitcoin they're acquiring ratchets up. And so usually for us, initially we'll recommend a custodial wallet. We had Galloy was a company that developed one specifically for Bitcoin Beach, and it has a map of all the vendors, and it works really well. But then there's, obviously security risks with keeping funds on your phone, and there's ways that, you can be rug pulled or, more likely hacked, your SIM swap, or if it's linked to your email. And so having to walk with them in that and start them and make sure that you don't overwhelm them in the beginning, but then also make sure they don't wind up with, having half a Bitcoin that they have on their cell phone. And I've had that experience, especially in price runs. You go to a vendor and they pull out their phone to scan, and you're like, oh my gosh, you should not be showing me that you have that much Bitcoin on your phone, and you should never have that much Bitcoin on your phone. And so just trying to figure out that balance of how you let them scale in their security protocols in the appropriate time. And because if you don't, then there are a lot of sad stories of people who do, usually it isn't even robberies. Usually it's just some type of, they lose access to the wallet and lose funds. And so being able to balance those things.
I would say finding the balance of respecting old wineskins and having the courage to step out into new wineskins. That this can be so out there, and God's calling some of us to step out in new ways and explore this new technology. And there's a temptation either to beat up the old wineskins that don't get it, or just to not do anything, or stay within that old wineskin and be like, well, I guess I just can't do anything because I can't convince X, Y, and Z people to do it. So respect the older wineskins, but have the courage to step out and be like, okay, God, what are you calling me to do? How can I build something new that hasn't been built yet?
Thank you, guys. And I will say, so Ahshuwah is working with Brilliance Labs, and basically they're working not quite full time, but they're working, very heavily to do as much as they can to help the church broadly, and especially the missions world, understand these things. So they're a nonprofit organization. They're again, the more resources that they have available to them, the more that they can deploy, the more people they can, more missions organizations around the world, missionaries around the world that they can help. So if that's something where, again, if the end of this year turns out to be anything approaching what we are hoping from, in terms of what we've come to expect from Bitcoin's performance, and you're looking for some place to deploy resources that will have kingdom impact like that, that's a fantastic place to go. So give everybody a round of applause, these guys.